Hi all, welcome back. So today we're looking at Birth of a Nation, that crazy film that you watched over the weekend, and I warned you, it was going to be a bit of a ride. And so let's get into that today. And again, with all lectures, this is the material you're going to want to know. This is where in terms of the questions that come out of the lecture, this is where they would come from. Okay, so you can look at that on your own time. So first off, what is the thesis of Birth of a Nation? What's the thesis? Well, D.W. Griffith makes it pretty clear. He makes it pretty clear. And the film is largely based on the Reconstruction era, which we're going to look at today, for second half anyway, and the more important part of the film. And the basic argument he's making is that Reconstruction was this this era where you have these radical politicians duped by the newly freed blacks, and them in tandem with these newly elected black officials, we get this corrupt era of black misrule, right? So, and it's all engineered by these radicals in control of Congress, radical Republicans. And then, of course, thank God, the KKK comes along, saves the day, and puts those freedmen back in their rightful place. And there you have that great intertitle of that, the former enemies of North and South united again in common defense of their Aryan birthright. And we had a signal of that early in the film, where there's an intertitle that says the bringing of the African to America brought the first seeds of disunion between whites. And so misunderstanding between brothers solved, and African Americans, the freedmen, are put back in their place. And there's that great intertitle. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. So not real subtle. There you got it, right? And that's history, and completely accurate. So let's take a look at just how accurate the film is. First, let's take a look at a couple of very obvious themes that we get at here, or that Griffiths gives us. And one of them is about the dangers of miscegenation. And we see that very, very clearly. And you probably picked up on this, the dangers of miscegenation, because we see it in the most evil characters of the film. And probably the worst of all is Silas Lynch. And he's Austin Stoneman's protege. Austin Stoneman is our duped radical Republican politician, Thaddeus Stevens, and he has this what was then called mulatto, we will call biracial protege, who's a schemer, and he represents all that is wrong and twisted and evil. And this is a clear indication of a real obsessive fear Americans have at the time, and it's only growing. It's only growing at this time. We get the black as beast ideology around the turn of the century, and that is fed on by social Darwinism, these new theories of going backwards down the evolutionary ladder. And America has a real problem that way with all these freed blacks that potentially could go very far down this evolutionary ladder. And we're starting to get the era of racial purity laws in the 1920s, and 26 states eventually create these, where marriage between white and black is completely prohibited. In any case, so the miscegenation is a clear theme in the film, and the evil characters are these biracial products. And another plot device showing that is that it gets at that obsessive old fear that Americans have, and of every African American. That's super dominant in the film, wanting nothing more than to have a white woman. And Flora, of course, represents the Southern belle, right? Virginity, purity, all that is good. And she is chased by Gus off a cliff, and has that dramatic. She somehow survives this amazing fall, which is problematic, but long enough, well, it's required because she needs that amazing death scene with her brother. Now, in the original book, in The Klansman by Thomas Dixon, that plot actually has the former slave Gus raping Flora, and the KKK then symbolically dipping their swords in her blood. Now, Griffith understood that this would be too much for an audience in 1915, so this is not in the film. It becomes this chase scene instead. But again, that gets at the dangers of miscegenation, the contemporary fears of Americans around this. Okay. Another theme worth looking at is, as students of history, you notice it right away, and if you're not, I hope I explain it well for you, but Griffith gives us what's known as the Southern states' rights view of the Civil War, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding between brothers, and it was over states' rights. It was not over slavery. Okay, so it was not first and foremost about slavery. It was about states' rights, and that way we can have a merging, a coming together again, and the African Americans are not central to the story. They're a sideshow, and it was a misunderstanding giving them political power, because this isn't what the war was about. And so for this film to work, we have to take the states' rights perspective, and Griffith very much is steeped in that, given his own culture and where he's from. And this is a strong. There's a strong tradition to this view of the Civil War, and it was certainly perpetuated by the Southern Historical Association as into the 20th century, well into the 20th century, that it's really an issue of state rights, and you often still hear that, the war between the states as opposed to the Civil War. And that kind of hints at this idea that it was simply about state rights. So we'll spend a bit of time looking at that. And one thing we have to admit is there is an issue of state rights. Okay, there is an issue of state rights. And this goes way back. This goes way back. Here we have John C. Calhoun, the very famous, he was a vice president, also South Carolina senator, and a leading politician in the antebellum era in the South, and defender of state rights and defender of the institution of slavery. And here's where the two merge, right? Where the states' rights is an issue, mainly because of the issue of slavery. So it's a circular argument to say it's slave rights, okay? Because at basis it really is all about slavery. The South said it's about state rights, but states' rights is an issue exactly because the North and the South, because the North wants to interfere with what's called their peculiar institution, their right to keep slaves. So it's a circular argument. But yeah, there is this history of states' rights issues, and it's not only about slavery. So there is that. There was a nullification crisis, which you can look up, which was really about the powers that the federal government has, the powers that the federal government has, that Congress has, vis-a-vis the states. And this gets to Amendment 10, where it's not spelled out, much like in Canada, where Section 95 and 96 don't spell out provincial versus federal for many things. And reserve rights seem to be, under Amendment 10, anything not specified or not adumbrated, listed, is reserved to the states. So this is the state Southern position, but where it matters most is in protecting slavery. And to defend the fact that the Civil War really is first and foremost about slavery is not very hard. Okay, and I'll do that for you hopefully quickly, because we don't want to spend too much time on that. But the Civil War really begins with the West, with going west. Okay, because what happens is when America defeats Mexico in the Mexican-American War between 1844 to 48, it gains a whole lot of new territory, and then the question becomes, will this be slave or free, which is the biggest issue in the country. It's what's fracturing all the political parties, so it becomes incendiary. This is the trigger. Defeating Mexico and taking all these new lands, and forcing the decision of what will happen to them. How will they be organized? Emerson, right, the great Emerson, he had a great quote by him. He said, "We shall defeat Mexico. It will be as the man who swallows arsenic. Mexico will destroy us," right? And he's 100% accurate. It doesn't happen right away. First, we get a compromise that California comes in as a free state. Now this upsets the balance, and that always matters. You need a balance in the Senate between free states and slave states, so that it's 50-50. And if you have an advantage, it can mean a lot. It can mean the end of slavery. The Compromise of 1850 did bring an imbalance in the Senate, but the South was pacified with a variety of ways, and one of the most important was the fugitive slave law, where now it becomes a federal offense, it becomes a hanging offense, a capital crime, if any federal official or any state official aids in or assists in the assist any way in a runaway slave in protecting them and not returning them to the South. Okay, so it makes any Northerner who's opposed to slavery complicit in slavery, in the institution of slavery, because it's not just about federal officials. Anyone, it becomes a law that anyone cannot ignore the crime of running away, right? So a runaway slave in the North, if you're aware of it, it is your responsibility to report it. If you're a federal official, it's a capital crime. If you do not, okay, so this becomes a major issue, and actually this runs counter to a lot of laws that have been passed by a bunch of northern states called personal liberty laws, where you are completely on your right to protect slaves that have run away from the South. So the fugitive slave law, which is really a revamped version of one that goes back to actually the Constitution itself, but the harshest version of one ever, is part of the Compromise of 1850 and leads to a few crises, famous crises where slave catchers are coming north and conflicting with Northerners, and it makes it impossible to be indifferent to slavery. Okay, so the Compromise of 1850 meant everything's about staving off an impending civil war at this point. Okay. Fugitive slave law repercussions, criminalizes assisting runaways, violates personal liberty laws, as I said, and it leads to the play Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who becomes a very prominent abolitionist for a religious family, her brothers as well, Lyman Beecher and whatnot, and very involved. But it also leads to this, which is almost worth talking about it just for this spate of rejoinder novels that are the anti-Uncle Tom's Cabin, all about the happy slave on the plantation. The plantation illusion, right? These kind of things. That's what it's called, the plantation illusion of the happy slave. And then you see that there in Aunt Phyllis's Cabin, which was exactly that. Not a great play, not well known. But Griffith's film is exactly in that tradition of the plantation illusion, the happy, faithful slave he doesn't want the vote. He's happy to serve his master, right? So that's worth pointing out. But Uncle Tom's Cabin is super important, and apocryphal stories that Lincoln, when he meets Harriet Beecher Stowe, says, "Oh, so you're the lady that started the Civil War." But important for winning hearts and minds about the slavery issue with the evil slave catcher Simon Legree, who's any case, interesting too, you'll see the play in Gangs of New York, and you'll see a New York audience, how they respond to it, not as you might expect for Northerners. Okay, so Compromise of 1850, fugitive slave law, things are getting worse. And then it gets even worse in 1854. This is an attempt to organize the Western territories into states. And of course, that raises, again, the issue of slavery and what we do with that. And a solution by a man named Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's rival, is popular sovereignty, which is a very bad idea indeed. It basically means that any new state that organizes itself in the West, the residents therein can vote slavery up or down in a referendum. Now this means this is a disaster on the first order, because it means that in any place where this happens, you'll have a civil war between the two sides. Okay. What comes out of this as well, before we go there, is the Republican Party. The Republican Party sees this and is so opposed to the direction that Congress is going here that it forms itself on this one issue. And initially they're called the Anti-Nebraska Men because they are opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, this provision, this popular sovereignty, which they see will be a disaster. So they're a one-issue party. They are about non-extension of slavery in the West. Important, the Republican Party and Lincoln are never for the abolition of slavery in the South. They believe it will wither away with time. They're about slavery having no future in America, and the future is in the West. Okay, but as I said, popular sovereignty, a terrible idea, and we see that first in Kansas, where we get kind of a foreshadowing of the Civil War, where they have a civil war in miniature with two competing state capitals, and we got abolitionists that are willing to pick up guns and kill their opponents, and we've got slavers who are willing to do the same, and they're all rushing to Kansas to vote fraudulently as residents and to fight each other over slavery. Okay, so Kansas becomes known as Bleeding Kansas, and it's completely a function of popular sovereignty. And here's where the famous abolitionist John Brown, who's maniacal, he goes with his sons, takes a bunch of broadswords and hacks to death a bunch of pro-slavers. Okay, and later tries to foment a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry, and is a famously failed slave rebellion, which is exactly what all Southerners fear by this point, that this is what the North wants, slaves to rise up against their owners and kill them. And for that he is executed. He becomes a martyr to the cause. Okay? So the two sides are growing further and further apart, the South becoming more and more unrealistic over time. And hardcore abolitionists, often religious zealots, are getting more and more Americans on side. Okay, so any case, long story short, Lincoln gets elected in the context of the fact that all the national parties are having a heck of a time staying together. The Whigs and the Democrats are both crumbling because they can't keep their allegiances on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. They can't hold together the national parties because they have North and South representatives. Republicans don't have that problem. They're a one-issue party with Northern support only. And so, and border states, those as well, which are important. In any case, Lincoln is elected, and as you can see here in the electoral map, 1860, it explains everything. He has no support south of the Mason-Dixon line. He has no support in the slave states. And this is what triggers secession. South Carolina invites all other slave-holding states to leave the Union and join them in secession in a new confederacy. Right? And even in that initial call to do that, you see that this is fundamentally about slavery. They know that Lincoln in the White House means that slavery will not be protected in the West, and that it has no future in the West, and this is where the big spoils are, the future is, and where big expectations for both Northerners and Southerners to control the West, and at least the Southwest, right? So at least that it will be a straight line across the country, and that Southern California and New Mexico, Texas, and these areas will be slave if the North is free, right? So this at minimum is what the South expects. In any case, so we get secession. It's 100% about slavery. That's my main point. Okay, another theme in the film is black service in the Civil War. And Griffith's depiction, again, not super nuanced. Right? They're bestial soldiers who have, right, they're like animals out of the cage who've been given guns and given uniforms. And well, look what happens, right? In this, so the same thing he does with black politicians, officials, he does with African Americans serving in the Civil War. It's a travesty, and this speaks to a really old fear too in America of slaves having guns, right? And the horror that Southerners experienced when this actually happened. And this is a pretty big story, black service in the Civil War. In fact, there's something called the self-emancipation thesis, that blacks basically freed themselves through their service in the Civil War. That takes it a bit farther, given that their numbers were 10%. But in a war of attrition, that's a pretty that can be a deciding factor. But in any case, Griffith's depiction is that they're a bunch of rapists, they are looters, they're corrupt, and they're definitely not soldiers. Okay. And at the end of the film, of course, they're surrounding the cabin, and they're right scary. Okay, so what's the truth on black service? Well, the truth is that they actually were an anti-civilian, plunder, arson, kind of mop up after the white army goes through southern regions, right? So they do have a reputation this way that lingers a long time in the South. But the reality is, the context is, this is not their fault. One, it took forever for Lincoln to agree to put blacks in uniform, to put anyone, North or South, Southerners who are escaping to the North and want to serve, or Northerners, Northern blacks who want to serve. He doesn't want to put them in uniform because it's incendiary. But then he sees that in this war of attrition, he really doesn't have a whole lot of choice, and we get a lot of lobbying by Northerners like Robert Gould Shaw to do exactly this, and that they can they can be very helpful. So he reluctantly agrees to the 54th Regiment. If you've seen the movie Glory with Matthew Broderick and Denzel Washington, Denzel does a great job in that one, and it's a pretty solid film actually, capturing the history and how they're used for things that for the grunt work, for stuff they don't want to do, much less than heroic and almost war crimes is what they're being told to participate in. Now, that said, what they're trying to do, African Americans during the war, is get a role in battle, but they're not allowed that role initially, at least, and that changes. With Robert Gouldshaw is significant here. He lobbies for a better role for his troops because they become disconsolate with what they're doing, and they're given the task of taking Fort Wagner after one failed effort. This is an important fort on the coast, and the 54th gets it. So an all-black regiment led by one white officer. And here we get some pretty heroic actions, and it becomes kind of like they fail, but they did volunteer for it, and when nobody else wanted to try, because Fort Wagner was seen as impregnable, and it turned out it was. And a good number of them gave their lives in trying to take this fort. So it becomes like the African American Alamo, and William Carney becomes like the Davy Crockett or the Jim Bowie, and he ends up with a few bullets in him after this, and survives. And this really is a turnaround, the Second Battle of Fort Wagner, and the perception of African Americans in the war in the North. And by this point, too, more battalions have been commissioned, the United States colored troops and whatnot, and they get they get more active roles in the war as things go on. But again, the memory in the South is them as plunderers and rapists and all the rest. And Griffith is playing on that, which has some, I won't say credibility, but there is this reputation. There's a rationale for why that reputation obtains, but it's in the context of white limitations and what blacks were seen as being allowed to do initially. Now, interestingly, at the same time that the second battle for Fort Wagner is happening, what we have in New York, and this is important for when we watch Gangs of New York, is the New York draft riots, where you have Northerners, working class Irishmen mostly, fighting against the draft, fighting against Lincoln's draft, and not just fighting the draft, but going to war against African Americans in New York who are seen as this cause that we don't want to fight for. They're seen as the cause of all the troubles that working class poor Irishmen are having in New York. And that gets to the fact that many in the North have no interest in freeing the blacks because they see them as what they will be, which is competition for their jobs. Okay, and so that theme comes out strongly in the Gangs of New York, and I just wanted to mention it here that in tandem with the Second Battle of Fort Wagner, we have the New York draft riots, which reverses history for many students. Okay, so now let's get into Reconstruction, the more important part of the film. Okay, so Reconstruction, if you're American, you know this and you're taught this, but it falls into two periods, and historians give it two periods: presidential Reconstruction and radical Reconstruction. Okay, so Reconstruction Part 1. After any war, there's a Reconstruction time period, right? We have that after World War II, definitely the era of Reconstruction, but when you do American history, when you say Reconstruction with a capital R, you mean the years after the Civil War, 1865 to 1877, when it ends. Okay, and the first part is presidential, and that's Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. Okay. And the thing about a civil war is there's no rules to how to fight this game, and there's no rules for what will happen afterwards. So what do you do with the vanquished enemy afterwards? It's very unclear. And then it gets complicated by the fact that Lincoln emancipates the slaves in the middle of the war, which had not been a game plan. It had not been his game plan. This is partly a religious conversion experience. It's partly war strategy. Okay, so Emancipation Proclamation, which frees only the slaves in the South. Only the slaves in the South in states That sounded stupid because there's only slaves in the South, only in states that are in rebellion against the Union as of this point of January 1, 1863, a few months down the road from when he gave it, okay? Because no states took him up on the offer of getting out of the war. As of January 1st, those slaves were freed, even though Lincoln had no control over them, no ability to actualize their freedom. They now knew that if they got to the North, if they got out of Dixie, out of the South, that they would have their freedom and it would be recognized by the White House. Okay, so Emancipation Proclamation changes really what the war is about, and I mean, it was about slavery all along, but now the stakes are even higher. It's about the abolition of slavery in the South now, not just in the future in the West. Okay, so presidential Reconstruction is there's debates about what Lincoln would have done, and we have an early indication of this, of what he would have done. As I said, no rules during the war, but rules are being set on the ground by generals that are fighting in the South, and then politicians are picking up on that. And the best example of that is when William Tecumseh Sherman, the great general, the great Union general, he's charging through the South in this broad swath, bringing destruction everywhere, burns the city of Atlanta to the ground, and then heads toward the coast. By this point, he's got thousands of African Americans who are following him and are expecting their freedom. If we follow Sherman's army, we have protection of the Union and by extension Lincoln and our own freedom. And when he gets to the coast, he pulls together about 30 or 40 African American pastors who are leaders in the African American community. And he asks them, "What do I do with all these thousands that are following me now that he makes it to the coast? He's leaving," and they say, or he's heading off to the north. They say, "Well, give them the freed plantation lands, the abandoned plantation lands here on the coast, the rich Carolina coastline of the rice plantation area." And he does that. He gives them each, that's a field decision, Field Order 15, give them each 40 acres and a mule. That's also the name of Spike Lee's production company. Very important decision, okay, Field Order 15. And Lincoln turns that into, here's our Sherman, by the way, and here's the area I'm talking about. Yes, Lincoln formalizes Field Order 15, and he goes one further. He goes one better, and he establishes something called the Freedmen's Bureau, which is very important. This is presidential Reconstruction Lincoln, and it shows what he's about. The Freedmen's Bureau is this body, and it was meant to last for 1 year. It becomes longer. Its service lasts much longer, and up until the end of Reconstruction. So it becomes an example of mission creep, I guess. Its scope keeps widening as the problems it confronts become more and more clear. Established by Lincoln to assist defend the freed slaves, also distribute the land as per Field Order 15. So he institutionalizes that. And this idea of giving 40 acres to each freedman of abandoned plantation lands, initially as a lease, and later on, after 3 years, they could buy it from the federal government. So the Freedmen's Bureau, very important, and is seen by Southerners as enabling, and you see it in Griffith's film. There's a special target in his film of these duped Northerners who are helping lazy African Americans do nothing, basically. It's how they get depicted in that film, not so subtle either. Okay, so Freedmen's Bureau, important. They also established thousands of schools in the South to educate African Americans and get them ready to be American citizens. And this speaks to a very old theme in America that goes back to Thomas Jefferson, at least, in this sense that slavery is dangerous, because if these people are ever freed, they will be American citizens, and they will be a sore on the body politic because they're not ready for citizenship. In fact, we've been very intentional about destroying their family structure and their and making literacy illegal for slaves, yada yada. So the idea was, if they are ever freed, they must be readied for citizenship, or preferably removed back to Africa, and that's called colonization. Now, both white supremacists as well as black nationalists were in favor of colonization for different reasons. But in any case, there's a very old theme in America that if the slaves are freed, it will be a problem for a republic. They need to be readied for citizenship. And that's what the freedmen schools are about. Colonization, that idea hasn't been given up on, and later on with President Grant, there will be an attempt to purchase Santo Domingo, purchase today's Dominican Republic, and resettle all the slaves there. It doesn't happen. But in any case, presidential reconstruction. This is Lincoln's idea. Lincoln believed in that some intelligent, and he said this, leading African Americans in the South, illiterate or whatnot, could be given the vote, that he saw that potential in the future. He did not act on that. But eventually the Freedmen's Bureau will be protecting the African American vote when the 14th Amendment happens, and I'll be getting to that. So Lincoln is assassinated, okay? And if you don't know much about history, you probably know that much, okay? By John Wilkes Booth. All assassins have to have 3 names. And there's interesting stuff about John Wilkes Booth. But Lincoln is assassinated. It's a tragedy of the first order that goes beyond the fact that he was an amazing individual and probably the greatest president in American history. The bigger tragedy is that his vice president is Andrew Johnson. Okay, and Andrew Johnson is a Southern slaveholder who gained slaves by marriage to his wife, who also has a bit of a hate-on for the planter aristocracy. So a contradiction that way, but he is what is known as a war Democrat. Okay, so why does Lincoln have a Southerner and a Democrat as a vice president? Well, what happens is during the Civil War, Lincoln is doing everything he can to keep the Union together and to invite these rebel states to come back into the fold. In fact, he takes the position that because it's unconstitutional to secede, they never really have. He doesn't recognize their secession, but he's always inviting them back in. And very important are the border states, because that's where he has the balance of power. That's where he has a foothold in the South, and he doesn't want to lose the border states at all. So Lincoln's hesitation, actually delay in something like the Emancipation Proclamation, and any time he's less than heroic when it comes to the African American interest, is you have to see that he's trying to curry favor among Southerners throughout the war, and especially in the border states he depends on for their support, because they could secede at any time. So the border states are between the North and the South, and that is where you get a lot of the Democratic Party is still which is a party of whites only, for whites only. It's a party of white supremacy. Is in power and is the favored party, but most of the population there is not in favor of secession. Okay, and so Andrew Johnson is that he's what's known as a war Democrat, and Lincoln appoints him because during the election in the war he needs to be able to appeal to the border states to win the election. So he appoints Johnson as this war Democrat as his vice president. In any case, this is how someone from the opposite party is vice president, becomes president now on Lincoln's death. The other problem with Johnson is I would have said until 4 years ago he was the worst president in American history, and I always used to say that. Millard Fillmore is up there too, but in any case, that's there's a whole new standard now for that one. But it's very, very similar. In fact, a lot of the themes we're talking about here are very similar to what we've seen in the last couple of years. It's incredibly so. But Johnson was a huge egotist, and was recognized as that, egotistic to the point of mental disease is the winning quote on him at the time. But more to the point, his whole agenda is to forgive and forget, because the South, because his wider impulse is to make sure the African Americans are back on the plantation, that the cotton economy gets going again, and that they stop and that they don't become that sore on the body politic, these raving bands of freedmen with nothing to do, these idle freedmen who will be out there doing who knows what kind of depredations on white people. So we need those blacks to be back on the plantation in manual labor, and it has to happen fast, and that overrides everything else. Even his mistrust of the planter aristocracy for being these super wealthy people who brought America into war, which is true, Right? He understands the hypocrisy of the war, and maybe you know this, that if you were in the South, you had an exemption from fighting in the war if you had more than 20 slaves. So the war is being fought for the very people who don't have to fight it. Okay? And very few people in the South even had slaves. It's about 3%. Okay? That have more than 20 slaves. It's a very tiny fraction. In any case, he doesn't. But as I said, his overriding concern, he's an out and out racist. He's an out and out racist. Does not see blacks as equal in any way. Even leading lights like Frederick Douglass, when he meets him. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, he says, whatever else this man is, he is no friend of the black man. After he meets Johnson, it's that palpable. But yeah, his concern is that things go back to normal. So because of that, he's willing to swallow anything and give, and he's handing out so many amnesties to Confederate leaders after the war. And the big question was, what will we do with these men who are now defeated and are responsible for what 400,000, 600,000 by the end deaths in the Civil War? Well, he's amnestying them all. There's going to be post-war trials of a few leaders, but that's it. Even guys like Jefferson Davis, even the head of the Confederacy, will not be. There won't be. He will not be executed, which is seen as a minimum by most Northerners. But yeah, amnesties and returning the vote to Confederates and giving them back their land. Not only that. He reverses Field Order 15, which is a travesty. For a few years now, by the time he does, we've had African Americans being, some of them being on these newly reclaimed properties on the coast for a few years, and having their own organic societies that are sustainable and functioning, and that land is taken away from them and given back to Confederates. Okay, given back to the old owners. So Johnson is, this is the other era of presidential Reconstruction. Now, an important point here about the film is Griffith is taking the view that Lincoln is similar to Johnson. He's trying to make it look like Lincoln would have gone the same way, right? The great paternalistic, benevolent father. Had he lived, he would have forgiven the South, and he's forgiving them already, right? So Lincoln can be the great hero because of his death, and the South can put these, and Griffith and other Southerners can put that construction on him that he would have been much like Johnson. He would have forgiven the South. Okay, so in any case, the evidence is not in that direction, as I've already explained, but Johnson absolutely takes it to a level that becomes it makes people question why, what did we even fight this war for? Then in terms of readmission of the southern states, he says that all they have to do is sign the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. Okay, if you've seen the movie Lincoln, you see how long Lincoln fought. He prolonged the war until he could get Congress to agree to the 13th Amendment, which was taking the Emancipation Proclamation and making it into the abolition of slavery forever, because the Emancipation Proclamation, as I said, was very limited. Okay, so in any case, that's a pretty light thing, right? They don't even have to take a loyalty oath, and so it's basically sweeping, turning the page on the Civil War and moving on, and ignoring the blood that still hasn't been washed off the coats of those who are elected representatives from the South, which he admits back into Congress. Okay, he admits them back into Congress. That's the other offensive thing that Johnson does, is he says these old state leaders from the South who brought the Civil War onto us all are now allowed readmitted into Congress. That's the straw that breaks the camel's back, and I'll get to that in a second. The other thing he does is he allows southern states to bring slavery back in kind of by legislative fiat, by not de jure but de facto, by bringing in these black codes, they're called, not slave codes. There used to be slave codes in all the southern states. Now there's black codes, and black codes are unbelievable. Beginning with Texas, and then the other states follow. It basically it takes away the civil rights of the freedmen. They must be in a contract, or they're they can be charged with violating law. It's a criminal law. It's a criminal violation not to be in a contract, in a labor contract. So officially, technically, you are being paid very little as a sharecropper, but you must be in a contract with a plantation owner in order to not be ultra vires the law, right? To not be in defiance of the law. So this is what the black codes are, much like the slave codes, and it's bringing it's slavery in everything but name. And it's brutal, and they have different provisions. Look it up, but and Johnson does nothing about this. He does nothing about this because this fits exactly with what he wants. Okay, so this is what causes Johnson is what causes the backlash. Okay, now we get, as I said, 1866, or as I said, the last straw was Johnson allowing Southern congressional reps back into Congress, and that's 1866, and that year becomes kind of a referendum on Johnson himself and on his Reconstruction policies. Now he's offended enough Americans and definitely enough officials that we get a swing against him, like a pretty hardcore, and the Republican Party becomes the radical wing of the Republican Party, which is wants Johnson removed and wants the South treated as a vanquished, defeated enemy and dealt with and reconstructed authentically. They take control of Congress, both levels, right? And so both houses. Okay, and the main two leaders here are Thaddeus Stevens, and he's Austin Stoneman in Birth of a Nation, and Charles Sumner, who's this old-time abolitionist who's been around for a long time. In fact, he gave a famous a speech in Congress at one point, and was caned over the head, beaten violently by a Southerner for what he had said. So he's. So we had the issue of Bleeding Kansas. That was called Bleeding Sumner, another crisis that had happened prior to the Civil War. So these are old-timey abolitionists, hardcore Republicans who are now in charge. Okay, and they impeach Johnson. Okay, they impeach him, which is not that hard to do. They've got him on this. On having broken the law, and almost a technicality, but in any case, because they control the House, not hard to do. They lose the removal vote by one. Okay, so as you now know with Trump, that there's impeachment and then there's removal from office. Now the second requires a 2/3 majority in the Senate. They lose that by one vote. But the important point is Johnson's now on a leash. He's been given notice. He's impotent. Okay, and so his career is over. He's basically a lame duck president at that point. And now the Republicans can do what they want. And so we get phase two, which is radical reconstruction, which is what Griffith hates. It's what his whole film is in reaction to. Okay? So radical reconstruction, A, is military districts in the South. Break up the South into military districts and reinforce the army there in bigger numbers, and then force all those breakaway states in the South to give the vote to Southern freedmen. Okay, give the vote to the Southern freedmen, which is huge. So African Americans are getting the vote for the first time. And then they have to draw up new constitutions. So they each have to have a state election, which will end up in constituent assemblies in each one, right? Which then will draw up will have conventions that will create new state constitutions, which then will lead to their readmission. So long as they implement the 14th Amendment, okay, which is this. that all persons born or naturalized in the states are citizens, and no state shall make or enforce any law which will abridge the privileges of them, basically giving civil rights to everybody, and everybody born in the USA, other than, and this is super not up where I wanted to go, other than Indians not taxed because they're a separate category, and I believe Chinese Americans, but look that up, which are not generally not citizens anyway. Without due process of law, you cannot deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. So everyone gets the equal protection of the law. So this is what has to happen. Okay? This is what the radicals force on the South. And so every state government in the South is disbanded. There's elections, and those elections, we have black people voting for them now, freedmen, right? And they're the majority in some southern states, specifically South Carolina and Louisiana. So, yeah, so blacks are voting, and a lot of another part of what happens in radical Reconstruction is a lot of the old Confederate soldiers lose the vote until they can take a loyalty oath. Okay, so the vote is skewed in favor of African Americans. So no surprise, we get Republican governments voted in all the former southern states. Okay, and they all, one after the other, adopt these new state constitutions, which pass the 14th Amendment. So they are legally bonded to the idea of equal protection of the law for all, regardless of color. Okay. Of course, this is all based on the fact that the U.S. Army and Freedmen's Bureau is still in the South. Okay, and that is what is keeping harmony in the South, and that is what is making all of this possible. Okay, so the fact that it's martial law in the South, and that's really important, and I'll remind you of that at the end of the lecture. But so now we get this really incredible time between the Civil War in 1877, where really there the bottom rail is on the top, okay, where it's a complete social revolution in the South as to who is in power, and we get the Republican Party being voted in every single one of the southern states based on the fact that the electorate is what it is, and the African American vote. And we also have, for the first time, black officials being voted into office. About 3,000 of them have been estimated of having taken office in this time period. 3,000. Now that's at the state level, as we see there in South Carolina, where Griffith makes a big deal of that. That's where we have that scene in the film, the South Carolina House of Assembly, but also at the federal level here. We get, in the congressional elections that follow this, we get a bunch of African Americans from the South going to Washington, D.C., okay? And they're not going there as slaves of representatives, they're going there as representatives. It's incredible. And a senator, and one representative with the unfortunate name of J.J. Lynch. But in any case, it is a radical time for sure, and ultimately not sustainable, because there hasn't been a social revolution in the South to support anything like this without a standing army to keep it in place. But yes, Republicans take all the southern states in these new enforced elections for new governments with freedmen voting. Each ratify the 14th Amendment, each are readmitted, and the slogan for the Republican Party in the South at the state level is the bottom rail is on the top, and we intend to keep it that way. Okay, which is pretty offensive to the good old boys in the South that fought in the Civil War and are intent on making sure it doesn't stay this way, which Griffith sees as the heroes in the story. Okay, so Griffith versus history. Let's look at how he sees them in this story. And here we have what I was just talking about, South Carolina. Now he focuses here, Griffith, because this is the one place, the only place in the South where you had a majority of African American officials in a state assembly, and not in the whole state assembly. It's a bicameral assembly in South Carolina, and the African Americans were in control in the lower house of South Carolina Assembly. So that is accurate, and he's gone to great lengths to create a historical facsimile of the State House of Representatives in South Carolina, exactly as it was in 1870, and he depicts And then he shows the actual bills that came through, right, at that time. So this must be real history. Okay, but what about the context? Okay, so yes and no. There is a black majority in the lower house in South Carolina at this point, right? And it's the only black majority, as I said, among the 11 Southern Reconstruction governments, and that's a function of the big African American population in that state. South Carolina and Louisiana had an African American majority. But but everything is in the representation, which Griffith doesn't understand. That his own bias is coming through in the film. And did you notice it? You think? They're completely bestial, right? They are monkeys out of the zoo, who shouldn't be here. They got their feet on the desk. All the stereotypes are here, eating the fried chicken. And then when passing laws allowing for intermarriage, what are they doing? They're staring up at the gallery and freaking out the poor white virtuous women who are standing there in the balcony, horrified by what they see. Right? So it's just unbelievably racist depiction of what actually did happen. Okay, but are they bestial and illiterate as depicted? No. Okay, and we know that the majority of these men were exactly like the white officials. They had property, and most of them were literate. And illiteracy is a big thing then. So a lot of the black representatives actually were African American pastors, okay, because they're the leaders in their community. And the black church was always at the forefront of the freedom struggle then and today. Okay, it's much more than just a religious institution, the AME church and other black churches. Okay, how about corruption? That's the other theme that's in the film, right? And there I'll introduce the term to you, carpetbagger. Carpetbagger, if you don't know it already, uh, Southerners like Griffith hate them as much as they did these black politicians for bringing corruption to the South. And the carpetbagger is a Northerner who heads south at this point in time during Reconstruction and bribes politicians in order to get lucrative federal contracts, okay? Because this is a point of time where the Congress is trying to rebuild the South in the image of the North, an industrial economy, and rebuild all the railroads and the factories, of which there are almost none in the South. Actually, the only real industry in the South is the railroads. But in any case, they're trying to change it from a cotton economy, primarily agriculture, into something that mirrors the North. It's a complete fail. And one of the interesting things is the Emancipation Proclamation is what set the South back because most of the equity in the South, most of its financing was based on the bodies of slaves. By 1860, there's 4 million of them. And they're each worth about $1,000 on average, and that's the equity. So as we borrow against our houses, our equity there in the South was based on the slaves. They were the biggest property in the South and the biggest source of revenue and what everything is based on. So the Emancipation Proclamation set back the South for a long time, and it wiped out a whole lot of wealth. And it proved impossible to rebuild of too big of a project. But in any case, billions and billions are being spent in the South, and there's tons of bribery, as is normal for that time period. If you know anything about history, we had the same thing here in Canada with a lot of bribery in railroads as well, right? And with politicians. Okay, this was normal, greasing palms. Now, was there anything racial about that kind of corruption? Right? Because the South calls it black misrule, and Griffith calls it black misrule. No. One thing is most of the representatives of the South are white. Okay, most of them are white. The vast majority are white. Okay, and so they outnumber black officials during Reconstruction, and they're as corrupt as the blacks. Okay, as black or white, colorblind. Corruption is colorblind. Okay, so as is the whole literacy thing, as I mentioned, and there's some out and out odd things. I mean, there was one of the black officials elected during Reconstruction in the South was an old slave owner. Okay, so even slave owning, plantation owning, was not colorblind, which is a real. Try to get your head around that one. That there were during slavery, there were examples of black plantation owners. Not a lot of them, and you don't want to make too much of that because those with an agenda will try to do that, but that definitely existed. Okay, so yes, there was corruption. Yes, there were carpetbaggers here and bribery. Was it black misrule? No, not at all, 100% not. Okay, if you want more on this, don't believe me, Eric Foner, he is the big name in this area. He has some great, well, he's got huge creds, and he has actually a survey text on American history, the struggle for freedom, it's called. Good stuff. And I just found this today in Slate, an article that he wrote about exactly this time, where he talks about this characterization of these black officials, the idea of black misrule during Reconstruction, and actually the creds that they had, the literacy levels that they had and whatnot. Okay, so any case, Griffith, no. Okay, he loses on this one, even though he's getting. He says he's getting the history right, and in some ways he is. In some ways he is. Okay. Before we go further on this, so you know, this is still an interpretation that's handed out, that's given out, and that in some circles is still seen as what happened during Reconstruction, that it was black misrule. Here's a sign in Colfax, Louisiana, where there's this very famous massacre of African Americans, and there in Colfax, it's memorialized still now as the Colfax Riot. On this site occurred the Colfax Riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event marked 1878 marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. Okay, now if you read about that, you find out that these African Americans fought against the KKK, which is trying to keep them from voting, and fought to maintain their rights after they lost them, and were cornered in this courthouse and slain in massive numbers. It's just a brutal massacre. Okay, and here it's called the riot. But more importantly, it's called the era of black misrule, carpetbag misrule. Okay, it's amazing. Okay, in any case, what happened in Colfax is exactly where we're transitioning to, which is how radical Reconstruction ends, and it ends in terrorism. Okay, this is how the whites take back the South, through secret societies, as Griffith portrays in the film. Through the KKK. So he portrays them as heroes. We hopefully see them slightly differently, very differently. But this is how white supremacy is reestablished in the face of this federal agenda, this radical Reconstructionist era of forcing the South to go in this direction and protecting blacks and their vote and all the rest of it. Okay? So, and those secret societies are numerous, but the most famous, of course, is the KKK, and they're also called the Knights of the White Camellia in other regions of the South. But the KKK begins with Nathan Bedford Forrest from Tennessee, who was a Civil War hero for the Confederacy, and it is more working class whites. Knights and White Camellia is more upper middle class. But in any case, their tactics are the same, and that is violence and intimidation. Put on bed sheets. And you've got that great scene in Birth of a Nation, which is just amazing, right? Where Austin Stoneman gets his inspiration. He sees these little kids putting sheets on and then scaring the black kids, and you think, oh, inspiration, right? Put on bed sheets. You can do whatever the hell you want. That's exactly what happens. It's as simple as that. It is as simple as that. This is how they take the vote back. They simply go out and lynch in goodly numbers. And pretty soon they're lynching not only people who try to vote, but anyone who stands up in their community and has some backbone and tries to maintain the social order that they finally won, right, during Reconstruction. So if you become a prominent leader in your community, watch out, your days are numbered. And this is really what happens. It's not just blacks being lynched, that needs to be said. A lot of whites are lynched by the KKK and these other secret societies, because if you're an ally of the blacks, you're as threatened as anyone else. Okay, so it's a reestablishment of white supremacy through the gun. Okay. That's as simple as that. And black voters are intimidated away from the ballot box. And with that, we get the victory of what's called, or we get the solid South, where the Democratic Party is voted back in because only whites are voting. And there really is no democracy in the South. The only vote that matters from 1877, which I'll talk about in a sec, right up until 1964, really, Freedom Summer maybe of 66, is the primary. If you get the primaries where, who's going to run for the Democratic Party in this district, that's where the contest is, like who gets to run for office. Because as soon as you are nominated to run, you're a shoo-in. You will get in because only whites are voting, and they're only voting for the Democratic Party, the Southern Party, the party of white supremacy. And so, yeah, solid South, and it's brought about through violence. Okay. Now, interestingly, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who's this Klan leader, and KKK being heroes in the film, but Bedford Forrest not making a cameo, although Jesus makes a cameo at the end, which is interesting. He is still memorialized in the South. I just looked it up today. Nathan Bedford Forrest State Park in Tennessee is still open for business. They close every day at dusk, so don't be sleeping there. But it's still the state park named after him. There's a statue for Nathan Bedford Forrest that's on the property of this guy who just died this past November, and it's about 20 feet tall. It's ugly as hell, so it's offensive in two ways. It's right next to the interstate. And everybody can see it, and it's surrounded by Confederate flags. And because it's on private property, there's nothing the state can do about it, and it's amazing. But in any case, it's not only private citizens that honor Nathan Bedford Forrest. And when I started teaching this course years ago, or teaching African American history, there were many, many memorials to Nathan Bedford Forrest. There was even a school in the South named after him. I think that's had a name change since then. I hope. In any case, KKK were the heroes in Griffith's film, and for a long time in the South. But then they were destroyed. This is the first iteration of the KKK, okay? And they were bankrupted by Congress, actually. So the Radical Reconstruction government, they're still in charge in the North, at least, and they go after these violent militias in the South. And the way they do it with the KKK is pretty genius. They charge most of their leaders with various crimes, and so they bankrupt them in having to defend themselves in court. And that's they do it through what are called the Klan Acts, the Force Acts. Okay, there's two sets of these. As much as you need to know. The KKK is extinguished that way. But the thing is, they've already served their purpose. And the other thing is, other vigilante groups will pop up when and where they're needed. So anytime African Americans start getting ideas about running for political office or whatnot, these other vigilante groups will appear. And we call those Democratic Party militias, right? These militias that help the Democratic Party stay in power. The Red Shirts is a prominent one, but there's a bunch. And that goes as late as 1896 in North Carolina. There's a coup of the Wilmington municipal government because a black man got elected. So the white people go on the rampage, and there's a coup. It's the only time in American history that a duly elected municipal government was overthrown because of the election of a black official. So these militia groups keep up their lynching ways, their violent ways, even though the Klan disappears. Okay, and more to the point, they won what they want. Okay, and the final point I want to give you is how Reconstruction officially ends. So this is how it ends on the ground, where the Klan and other militias, other white militias take over. But how and intimidate whites away, blacks from the voting booths, which is as simple as it is if you keep people from voting, they have no citizenship really, and importantly, they cannot serve on juries, right? So you cannot get justice in a courtroom in the South because African Americans aren't voting. So how does it end? Well, it ends in the Compromise of 1877. So we've had a series of compromises to keep slavery intact and keep America from civil war. And then we have a compromise to keep the South as it was and allow it to reconstruct itself or not in 1877. And it happens, believe it or not, in a contested election with, believe it or not, disputed returns from Florida. Okay, so it sounds a bit like 2000 because it is. And Louisiana and South Carolina, all of which had Republican governments. They're the only ones that still do. Okay, in the South. In any case, contested election, it's super close, and And so the Southerners see an opportunity here, the Democratic Party, and that is to give the White House to the Republicans with some caveats, and the main one being, get the army out of Dixie. Okay, leave us alone, and we will sign on the dotted line to make you feel better, to obviate your conscience in doing this, in not protecting blacks anymore here. We will sign on the dotted line that we will honor the civil rights of African Americans and their voting rights, right? But of course, we will not. So federal troops withdraw from southern states. Rutherford B. Hayes takes the White House by one, and that's it. That is the end of Reconstruction. And any effort to change the social order in the South and to protect African American voting rights up until the 1960s, punting it down by several generations. And not only that, but now we get Jim Crow segregation, whites, colored, and in every possible conceivable way in the South, and eventually also validated by Supreme Court decisions. And we get voter literacy and civics tests for voting, which served the purpose that the KKK had initially, and which these other militias, as I say, crop up from time to do as well. But increasingly they don't have to, because here's a great genius way to keep blacks from voting is you implement literacy tests. Now, a lot of whites are illiterate, but you don't give them the test. And then there's civics tests, which are fascinating. These are these tests that none of us would ever be able to complete on time or accurately. Okay, they're just insanely difficult, and they're designed to be given to any African American who's bold enough to walk into a voting place and try and cast their ballots in any election. Okay, whether it's state or federal. Okay, so yeah, the bottom rail is back, is reversed again. The whites are back on top, and we have the solid South that goes on, as I said, until the 1960s. Significance of Reconstruction, if you're looking for something a little bit deeper, and here's an interesting point, I think, is that the Compromise of 1877 is just so symbolic, and it's really a compromise. You know, it's by whites, it's of whites, for whites, nothing to do with African Americans at all, right? So both sides can be happy now, and that's much like the compromises that had been forged before the Civil War to keep America together, not in the interest of African Americans, either in slavery or in freedom. Okay, they are very much secondary. The other lesson here, and this is even more profound, is America simply was not ready. The South was not ready for that kind of reversal by government fiat. Okay, that this kind of radical Reconstruction, where blacks are being voted into office and making and being in wielding political power over whites, is not going to be accepted, right? Absent some kind of social revolution among the population. That can only be kept in place by force. That kind of a social order can only be kept in place by force, so it was not sustainable. And there's a great quote here that I'll leave you with. And it's by Albert Hubbard, who, fascinating guy, an anarchist, who died on the Lusitania. So fascinating for two reasons, and for three, this great quote which he gave us, which then later on FDR kind of plagiarized from him. But anyway, he said, freedom cannot be bestowed, it must be achieved. So for freedom to be real, those who it cannot be given. It cannot be given. It has to be fought for to be real, because it's in the fighting for it that you get that grassroots strength, and you have what it takes to maintain it. Okay, so freedom that was given during Reconstruction was ultimately not sustainable, and absent both because African Americans largely are not ready for it, and did not fight for it, and don't have the tools to fight for it. And secondly, because whites, and more importantly, because white Americans in the South are definitely not ready for this, okay? And won't be for a good long time, and it will still have to be fought for when it does happen. very much later. In any case, that's it. That's the story and the glory. That's us taking a look at Griffith, put him under the microscope. How is he as a historian? Not so great, which you probably guessed anyway from looking at the film. But here's a way to learn quite a bit about this really important period in American history with some themes that resonate right to today. In any case, yeah. Any questions about any of this? I know it's quite a bit. Let me know. Thanks for listening.